Imagine the world exactly as it is right now, in this very moment, as you sit watching this screen. There are sprawling, luminous cities stretching across every continent on Earth. New York, Tokyo, Dubai, Sao Paulo. Skyscrapers of glass and steel that pierce the clouds. Highways that run like concrete rivers, tying it all together. There is an invisible web of internet signals connecting billions of minds in a fraction of a heartbeat. We hold smartphones in our palms. We rely on satellites drifting in the cold vacuum of space. We build cars that drive themselves. We sent human beings to walk on the dust of the moon more than 50 years ago. We have sent robotic explorers to the red plains of Mars. We have even decoded the microscopic blueprint of our own DNA. All of this, absolutely everything that defines modern civilization, happened in the last 10,000 years. That is it. A mere 10 millennia separate the very first farming villages from the lunar landing. But here is the thought that should keep you staring at the ceiling tonight. Modern humans, individuals anatomically identical to you and me, have been walking this earth for at least 300,000 years. Just let that timeline settle in your mind for a second. 300,000 years of human beings possessing the exact same brain capacity that we have tonight. The exact same potential for innovation, for breathtaking creativity, for solving impossible problems. And yet, for 290,000 of those years, we built practically nothing. No cities, no agriculture, no written words, no permanent structures of stone, just small, quiet bands of individuals wandering from one horizon to the next, hunting animals, gathering wild plants, sleeping under the open canopy of stars, or deep within the shelter of caves. For nearly 250,000 years, your ancestors lived exactly like this, the exact same rhythm of life, repeating generation after generation after generation. What were they doing with all that time? That is the profound mystery we are stepping into tonight. And if you are using the sound of my voice to drift off to sleep, that is perfectly fine. That is exactly what this journey is for. So perhaps subscribe to the channel and leave a soft comment to tell me where in the world you are and what time it is outside your window. I truly love reading those. It is a beautiful, crazy thing to imagine Tokyo at sunrise, London at the lunch hour, and Los Angeles at midnight, all sharing this exact same moment together. Most historical documentaries begin with Mesopotamia. They start with Egypt, with the dawn of the first great empires. But doing that is like walking into a theater for the final act of a very long movie. The real story, the deep and sweeping story of us, played out long before the first brick of Babylon was ever laid. For 90,000 years after the evolution of anatomically modern humans, we were out there doing something. We survived. We adapted. We walked across the face of entire continents. We engineered complex languages, breathtaking art, intricate social bonds, and highly sophisticated tools. We learned how to thrive in environments that ranged from blistering, sun-scorched deserts to the freezing, unforgiving tundra. But we did not build a single city. We did not plow the earth. We did not tame wild beasts into livestock, forge massive empires, or write down a single word. Why? Were our ancestors simply not smart enough? No. The archaeological record is absolutely clear. They had the exact same brain hardware that you possess right now. They could think in abstract concepts. They could plan for seasons that had not yet arrived. And they could engineer complex tools from raw stone. Some of the most brilliant, ingenious survival strategies ever conceived by the human mind date back to this very era. Were they simply too exhausted, too busy trying to stay alive? Perhaps. But many bands of hunter-gatherers actually had a vast amount of free time. Studies of modern foraging societies show that they frequently work fewer hours in a week than the average person living in an agricultural or industrial society today. Were they missing one crucial piece of knowledge? Maybe. But what was it? What was the secret spark that finally ignited the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago? This is the mystery of the 90,000 years. It is a massive, silent ocean of human history that textbooks usually skip right over. An era where we were fully, completely human, yet living lives that are almost unimaginable to us now. Tonight, we are going on a journey through that hidden history. We will begin in Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago, when a tiny population of modern humans took the first steps of a journey that would eventually populate the entire globe. We will look closely at what the daily life of these ancient people actually felt like, how they pulled food from the earth, how they raised their children, how they faced down terror in the dark, and how they made sense of the cosmos above them. We will follow the Great Migration as human beings poured out of Africa, crossing the vastness of Asia and Europe, eventually setting foot in Australia and the Americas. We will explore the birth of art, those first haunting cave paintings and carved figures that prove our ancestors were doing far more than just surviving. They were dreaming about beauty, about meaning, about the sacred. We will examine their technology, the slow, steady accumulation of wisdom handed down through the generations. The mastery of fire, the balance of a spear, the stitching of clothes, the raising of shelters, the shaping of boats. Every single innovation was bought and paid for through hard-won trial and error. And we will confront the fundamental question resting at the bottom of this mystery. If humans were capable of building civilizations for 90,000 years, why did it take so incredibly long? What shifted 10,000 years ago that pushed us from nomadic foragers to settled farmers, and ultimately to the builders of cities? The answer is not a simple one. It involves shifting climates, lucky accidents, the invisible pressure of growing populations, and likely a few elements we still do not fully comprehend. But one thing is absolutely certain. Those 90,000 years were not wasted time. This was not a humanity spinning its wheels, waiting around for someone to invent a plow. This was the foundation. Everything that came after, every empire, every moon landing, every single aspect of human culture today sprouted from seeds that were planted during those long, quiet millennia of wandering. Your ancestors were not primitive. They were pioneers. And their story is still our story. So let us turn the clock back, far, far back, to an age when the human population was breathtakingly small, when the world was entirely wild, and when simply waking up to see the sunrise was a triumph of survival. We are going back 100,000 years, and you are about to discover what your ancestors were actually doing for 90 millennia before they ever laid the first stones of a city. Here is what most people misunderstand about the dawn of modern humans. We did not just suddenly step onto the stage 100,000 years ago, fully formed and ready to conquer the globe. The truth is far stranger and much more complicated. Your direct ancestors, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, had been walking the plains of Africa for at least 200,000 years before that, perhaps even longer. Recent unearthings in Morocco push that timeline back to 300,000 years. These people looked like us. If you dressed them in modern clothes and put them on a subway train in New York, no one would look twice. They had the same shape to their skulls, the same bodily proportions, the exact same physical equipment. But they were not us. Not quite yet. Because for at least 200,000 years, these anatomically modern humans did virtually nothing new. They had the same brain, likely the same vocal cords, the same hands capable of delicate, extraordinary work. But their toolkits barely shifted. Their behaviors remained frozen in time. They lived in small pockets, chipped simple stones, hunted, gathered, and left behind almost no trace of the complex, symbolic thought that defines humanity today. Then, around 100,000 years ago, a shift occurred. Something deep and mysterious that anthropologists refer to as the cognitive revolution. And nobody knows exactly what triggered it. The archaeological records from this window show a sudden, brilliant explosion of complex behavior. It did not happen everywhere at once, and it was not a straight line. It happened in scattered, brilliant bursts across different regions of Africa. Sites that had held the exact same, unchanging stone tools for thousands of years suddenly began to yield evidence of something entirely new. Abstract thought, symbolic behavior, the birth of culture. Consider Blombos Cave, resting on the southern rugged coast of South Africa. Roughly 100,000 years ago, the people living in this cave started doing something no human had ever done before, at least not in any way that left a physical mark. They began to carve geometric patterns into chunks of ochre, a deep red mineral pigment. These were not random, accidental scratches. They were deliberate, repeated designs, crosshatches, intersecting lines, patterns that required a plan and a purpose. Why would anyone do this? Ochre does not make your hunting spear fly any truer. It does not help you pull roots from the dry earth or build a roof over your head. Carving patterns into a rock serves absolutely zero immediate survival function. It is symbolic behavior. It is abstract thought. It is the breathtaking ability to invent a meaning that exists entirely beyond the physical world. And here is what makes it even more profound. This was not the work of one lonely genius. Multiple people at Blombos were carving these exact same patterns over a span of centuries. That means they were teaching each other. They were passing down a tradition. They were creating shared cultural meanings that outlived any single human life. This is the exact line that separates us from the rest of the natural world. It is not the use of tools. Crows and chimpanzees use tools. It is not even complex cognition. The Neanderthals had that. 2. What makes us entirely unique is our ability to create shared systems of symbols. To look at an object and collectively agree that it means something beyond its physical shape, and to hand that invisible meaning down to our children. But the scratched ochre was only the beginning. Around the same time, sites across Africa started revealing traces of personal jewelry. Small seashells, meticulously pierced with holes, clearly meant to be strung together and worn against the skin. These shells were not found on the beach. They were discovered, sometimes, hundreds of miles inland. Someone walked an immense distance just to gather very specific shells, carried them all the way back, carefully drilled holes into them, and crafted them into jewelry. Just think about the weight of that. These people cared about how they looked. They cared about their status, about what they were signaling to the rest of their tribe. They had developed a self-awareness sophisticated enough to worry about how other human beings perceived them. They understood that an object could carry social weight, that wearing a certain string of shells could broadcast exactly who you were and where you came from. This is the dawn of culture as we know it, sparking to life in isolated pockets across Africa, 100,000 years ago. Now, we must talk about the world these early, behaviorally modern humans were actually living in. Because understanding their landscape is the only way to understand why this cognitive revolution sparked when it did. 100,000 years ago, Africa was not a gentle place. The earth was locked in the icy grip of a glacial period. Massive sheets of ice suffocated much of the northern hemisphere. And while Africa was not buried under glaciers, the climate effects were absolutely brutal. The Sahara, which is currently the largest hot desert on Earth, was even more extreme. Rainfall across the continent was chaotic and entirely unpredictable. Great lakes that had provided life for thousands of years could turn to dust in a single generation. Rivers that sustained entire populations would simply vanish into the earth. Your ancestors were not living in a lush tropical paradise. They were fighting tooth and nail to survive in a landscape that could turn lethal without a moment's notice. Resources were incredibly scarce and scattered. Animal herds experienced massive population crashes. Edible plants that had fed a family line for centuries could fail to bloom during a prolonged drought. Under these punishing conditions, intelligence was not just a nice bonus. It was the only way to stay alive. The bands of humans who could innovate, who could remember the hidden locations of deep water holes during a drought, who could invent new ways to trap migrating birds, who could figure out how to process toxic plants that other groups could not even touch. Those groups lived to see the next sunrise. The others did not. Natural selection was operating at its absolute maximum intensity, and it was aggressively selecting for the exact types of cognitive brilliance we see erupting in the dirt 100,000 years ago. But here is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were not alone on this planet. They shared the Earth with at least 3 other distinct species of humans, and quite possibly more. The Neanderthals were already deeply rooted across Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans were expanding through Eastern Asia, and Homo erectus, a remarkably successful species that had been walking the Earth for nearly 2 million years, was still clinging to life in pockets of Southeast Asia. It was not like today, where Homo sapiens stands utterly alone. It was a crowded world of multiple human species, all fighting for the same resources, all adapting to different climates, all walking their own evolutionary paths. The Neanderthals, by this point, were absolute masters of survival. They had been living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They possessed brains that were actually larger than your ancestors. They had thicker, more robust bodies and highly sophisticated stone technology. They hunted the massive, terrifying mammals of the Ice Age, using tightly coordinated group tactics. They controlled fire with precision. They buried their dead in the earth. By every metric, they were at least as successful as your modern human ancestors, and quite possibly more so. The Denisovans remained ghosts to us, leaving behind very few bones. But their genetic echoes prove they were incredibly diverse and widespread. Some of their people adapted to the thin air of high altitudes. Others seemingly figured out how to cross open water. They were innovating and spreading just as effectively as anyone else. So why did your ancestors, these early behaviorally modern humans wandering the harsh plains of Africa, ultimately outlive every single one of them? What did they possess that the others lacked? The secret seems to lie in the way they organized themselves socially. And that brings us to one of the most vital yet overlooked aspects of life 100,000 years ago: the social web. Your ancestors lived in small nomadic bands, likely hovering around 25 to 50 people. Extended family groups that moved constantly across vast territories, chasing the rhythm of the seasons. But unlike the other human species, these bands were not islands. The dirt tells us they kept in contact with other groups, sometimes across hundreds of miles. Those pierced seashells from distant shores were not just pretty necklaces. They were receipts. They were physical proof of trade networks, of sustained relationships between tribes separated by staggering distances. Someone was walking those trails, maintaining those friendships, trading goods and exchanging whispers of the world. This is where complex language becomes the ultimate weapon. You cannot hold a sprawling social network together without sophisticated communication. You have to negotiate. You have to make promises that hold their weight across time and space. You have to sit by a fire and tell vivid stories about distant cousins, keeping the bonds of kinship alive with people you might only see once every few years. The birth of fully modern language gave your ancestors an unprecedented superpower: the ability to cooperate over massive distances. They could trade highly detailed maps of where the water was hiding, where the predators were hunting, and how to craft a better blade. If one small band figured out a brilliant new survival trick, that knowledge could ripple across an entire region in a single generation. The Neanderthals almost certainly spoke to one another, likely in a very complex way. But their genetic legacy suggests their populations were much more isolated, much less woven together. They lived in smaller, deeply independent groups. That made them incredibly tough and efficient in their local valleys. But it crippled their ability to share a good idea across their entire species. Your ancestors were building something entirely new. Not just families, but networks. Not just hunting parties, but systems of exchange that could pump raw materials and life-saving information across the veins of an entire continent. This social technology, this invisible ability to cooperate on a grand scale, would eventually prove more powerful than any physical strength. But make no mistake, the daily reality for these early modern humans was brutally unforgiving. Let us look closely at what waking up actually felt like 100,000 years ago. You are born into a band of maybe 40 people. Almost all of them share your blood. Your mother's sisters, your father's brothers, your cousins, your grandparents. If you are incredibly lucky, Your grandparents are still breathing, but that is rare. Average life expectancy hovers somewhere around 35 years. But that number is a bit of a trick, skewed by a catastrophic rate of infant mortality. If you can just survive to see your 5th birthday, you actually have a solid chance of seeing 50 or 60. But reaching that 5th birthday is a terrifying gauntlet. Your family is always moving. You never stay in one camp for more than a few weeks, maybe a few months at the absolute most. You follow the herds. You track the quiet blooming of seasonal roots. You walk from one shrinking waterhole to the next. Everything you own in this world must be carried on your back. The total weight of your culture's material possessions is probably less than 30 pounds. Yet your toolkit is a marvel of engineering. Around this time, humans in Africa are crafting what archaeologists call Middle Stone Age tools. These are not the clumsy, heavy hand axes of the ancient past. These are delicate, razor-sharp blades of stone. Some are shaped using pressure flaking to create edges that could shave hair. Spear points balanced for very specific types of prey. Specialized scrapers for softening animal hides, carving bone, and shaping wood. A single one of these tools could demand hours of intense focus to create. You had to find the exact right type of rock, understand exactly how it would fracture when struck, and shape it through dozens of precise, calculated blows. This required a master and an apprentice. It required patience. It required the cognitive ability to close your eyes and see the finished blade trapped inside the rough stone before you ever took your first swing. But stone was not your only technology. Your ancestors were the absolute lords of fire. They didn't just use it when lightning struck a dry tree. They summoned it at will. They knew exactly which woods burned hot and fast, and which smoldered slow and steady. They knew how to wrap embers in fungus to carry a living flame through a freezing rainstorm. They used thick smoke to cure strips of meat and waterproof their clothing. Fire gave them the power to unlock calories in tough, fibrous roots that would otherwise rot in their stomachs. It expanded their menu and fueled their growing brains. But fire did something else. It created a social stage. When the sun dipped below the horizon, which happens with a sudden, heavy darkness near the equator, the fire became the center of the universe. It was where the band pulled close together, where the roasted meat was passed from hand to hand, where the stories were woven into the night air. It was where children sat wide-eyed, absorbing the invisible rules of survival. It was where the complex social glue of the tribe was applied and set. And it is by the light of those fires that the first flickers of human spirituality likely began. Because around this time, your ancestors started looking up at the dark and asking questions that had no practical answer. What happens when our hearts stop beating? Why do the great herds move when the wind changes? What are those cold white lights scattered across the black sky? Where did we come from? The physical proof of this early spirituality is quiet and debated. We do not find massive stone temples or elaborate golden tombs from this era. But we do find those scratched pieces of ochre. We find the pierced shells. We find behaviors that offer absolutely 0 calories, but seem heavy with meaning. Some scholars believe those geometric patterns were tied to states of trance, perhaps brought on by rhythmic drumming and exhausted dancing around the flames. That these ancient minds were actively seeking doorways into altered states of consciousness, reaching out for something lingering just beyond the edge of the firelight. Others point to the careful hoarding of strange objects. A beautiful quartz crystal, a fossilized shell, an oddly shaped stone, collected and carried in a leather pouch for hundreds of miles, not because they were sharp, but simply because they were beautiful. This suggests a profound level of self-awareness, not just knowing that you are alive, but wondering why you are alive. Not just feeling fear or joy, but sitting quietly and analyzing those emotions. Not just surviving the day, but wondering what a day is actually worth. And all of this explosion of the mind, this dawn of culture and spirit, is happening in scattered, dusty camps across the vastness of Africa, 100,000 years ago. Not everywhere at once, but spreading, sparking, building the invisible toolkit that would one day allow humanity to claim the entire Earth. During this 10,000-year window, your ancestors were not yet the kings of the world. They were still bleeding, still starving, still losing ground to the brutal African climate and the teeth of the wild. Many bands quietly faded into extinction. Countless brilliant innovations were lost in the dirt when the genius who invented them took their last breath. But the network held. The invisible threads connecting those scattered camps allowed the best ideas to survive, even when the people did not. And slowly, generation by generation, the cognitive machinery of the modern human was being assembled. What happened next would push that machinery to its absolute breaking point. Your ancestors were about to walk into a storm that would either wipe them from the face of the earth or forge them into a force of nature unlike anything the planet had ever seen. The only question was, were they ready? Let us take a moment to look at what your ancestors actually did with a regular Tuesday, because the truth of it might shock you. For the vast majority of the Paleolithic era, daily life was not the desperate, blood-soaked nightmare of suffering we see in the movies. Yes, there were famines. Yes, people died at ages we now consider tragically young. But on an average week, when the weather was fair and the local predators were keeping their distance, your Paleolithic ancestors worked significantly less than you do. A lot less. The best data we have, pulled from studying modern hunter-gatherers, suggests that ancient humans spent maybe 15 to 20 hours a week doing what we would call work. Hunting, pulling roots, scraping hides, knapping flint. That is it. The rest of their time was spent socializing, playing with their children, gossiping, napping in the shade, carving art, and just being alive. They had an abundance of leisure time. Except they didn't divide their lives into clocking in and clocking out. Life was just life. Imagine waking up, no alarm clock screaming at you, just the soft, pale light of morning bleeding through the entrance of your rock shelter or the woven branches of your hut. The communal fire in the center of camp has burned down to a soft, glowing red ash. But it is never truly dead. Someone, usually whoever woke up first, has already tossed a few dry branches on it and coaxed it back to a crackle. Tending the fire is a 24-hour duty, shared by anyone old enough not to burn their hands. The morning air is sharp and cool. You are standing somewhere in what will one day be called southern France, though borders and nations mean absolutely nothing to you. What matters is that this valley has a sweet water spring, fat deer in the woods, and a massive grove of nut trees a day's walk away. Your band of 30 people has been coming to this exact spot every autumn for centuries. Your great-grandmother knew the curve of these hills. The first order of business is breakfast, but it is not a bowl of cereal. Someone passes around a slab of tough, smoke-cured meat from a hunt a few days ago. Someone else has already wandered out into the morning dew and brought back a handful of bitter wild greens. Things your modern palate would probably reject, but they are packed with the exact vitamins your blood needs. You sit shoulder to shoulder around the smoke, speaking in low tones, planning the hours ahead. And this is where the daily division of labor gets genuinely fascinating. Because despite the tired old myths, Paleolithic life was not a rigid world where men only hunted and women only gathered. The reality was fluid, dynamic, and highly practical. Yes, the men typically took on the heavy, dangerous work of tracking big game, the kind of hunting that required jogging after a wounded beast for 3 straight days, or standing toe-to-toe with something that could crush your ribs with a single blow. But women hunted too. They set snares for rabbits, brought down birds, and trapped smaller game near the camp. Recent digs have completely shattered our old assumptions. We have found the skeletons of ancient women buried with heavy hunting weapons. We have found female bones showing the exact same stress fractures in the shoulders and elbows as male hunters. The undeniable physical scars of a life spent hurling heavy spears at moving targets. But the true quiet power in a Paleolithic tribe belonged to the gatherers. And gathering was predominantly, though not exclusively, the realm of the women. Here is why they were the backbone of survival. In almost every environment on Earth, gathered food provided 60 to 80% of the calories the camp actually ate. Meat was a luxury. It was vital for its dense fats and proteins, absolutely. But meat was a gamble. Hunts failed. Herds vanished like smoke. A sudden blizzard could make tracking impossible. But the roots, the nuts, the seeds, the berries, the shellfish, the insects, these were the reliable bedrock of human survival. And the sheer volume of intellectual knowledge required to be a master gatherer was staggering. Just think about the database a seasoned gatherer carried in her mind. Which of the 400 plants in this valley will feed us, and which will stop our hearts? Which bark cures a fever? When exactly does this specific berry turn sweet, and which side of the hill does it grow on? How do you boil the bitter, toxic tannins out of an acorn so a child can eat it safely? Where do the ground-nesting birds hide their eggs in the spring? At what exact hour does the ocean tide pull back far enough to expose the oyster beds? You could not Google this. This was a living, breathing encyclopedia of ecological genius that took decades to master. Little girls started learning from their mothers and aunts the moment they could walk. By the time a woman reached adulthood, she possessed a PhD-level understanding of her local botany. And this knowledge was highly social. The women rarely foraged alone. They went out in groups, moving through the brush, talking, laughing, and constantly trading data. They noted which groves were thinning out. They shared a new way to crack a stubborn shell. This informal, chattering network of shared observation was arguably more critical to keeping humanity alive than any heroic spear throw. Meanwhile, the men out on the hunt were engaging in a totally different kind of cognitive marathon. Tracking a massive Ice Age beast required reading the environment like a detective, analyzing the shape of a footprint in the mud, poking at animal droppings to judge exactly how many hours ago the creature passed by. It required a profound empathy, the ability to step inside the mind of a deer and predict which way it would bolt when spooked. It required the iron discipline to crawl on your belly through wet grass for hours, and the seamless, silent teamwork to trap a 6-ton mammoth without getting trampled into red paste. A successful mammoth hunt meant the entire camp ate like kings for a month. But it was a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. Here is something else that would deeply unsettle a modern parent. Raising a child in the Paleolithic world was an aggressively communal affair. Your baby was not just your problem. Your baby belonged to the tribe. The entire camp had a vested, desperate interest in making sure that child survived, learned the rules, and eventually pulled their own weight. Infants were held constantly. By their mothers, yes, but also by their older siblings, their uncles, the grandmothers, and completely unrelated adults. The dirt tells us that Paleolithic women spaced their pregnancies out much further than women in later farming societies, often waiting 4 or 5 years between births. That meant every single child received an intense, laser-focused amount of care in their most vulnerable years. They were nursed for years. They were never left alone in a dark room to cry it out, because a crying baby alone in the dark attracted wolves. As they grew, they entered a prolonged, wild childhood. Human children take longer to mature than almost any other mammal on Earth. But that decade of play was not wasted time. It was a massive download of cultural software. Toddlers played in the dirt, mimicking the adults. They made tiny, useless stone tools. They threw sticks at imaginary mammoths. They helped drag dry wood to the fire. As they hit their teenage years, they started shadowing the adults in earnest. The girls joined the foraging loops. The boys carried extra spears on the edge of the hunting party. And watching over all of this were the elders, your grandparents, if you were lucky enough to have them. They were the most valuable resource your tribe possessed. They were the hard drives of the Paleolithic world. An elder who had survived to see their 60th winter had lived through droughts that the young hunters could not even imagine. When the salmon mysteriously stopped running, or the spring rains never came, the young folks panicked. The elders simply cast their minds back 40 years, remembered the hidden emergency springs 3 valleys over, and calmly pointed the way. They encoded life-saving maps and survival protocols into beautiful, rhythmic stories told by the fire. And let us talk about that fire. Fire was everything. It was your furnace, your living room, your wall of defense, and your kitchen. By the time we are talking about, your ancestors were undisputed masters of the flame. The bow drill, spinning a hardwood stick into a soft wooden board until the friction birthed a glowing ember, was likely second nature. They also knew how to strike iron pyrite against flint to shower sparks into dry moss. But fire's greatest gift was cooking. Cooking was a biological revolution. It neutralized the toxins in wild plants. It murdered the parasites hiding in raw meat. It broke down the tough cellular walls of roots. pre-digesting the food so the human stomach didn't have to work so hard. Cooking allowed humans to extract massive amounts of calories with very little digestive effort. Many evolutionary biologists believe this surplus of easy energy is exactly what allowed our brains, which are massive, greedy energy hogs, to grow so large. Cooked food fueled the human intellect. But the flames also manipulated time. When the sun went down, the rest of the animal kingdom went to sleep, or became terrified prey for things that hunt in the dark. Humans, however, just threw another log on the coals and extended their day. They sat in the golden light, repairing their weapons, sewing leather, and talking. That nighttime chatter was the crucible of human culture. It was where myths were born, where the invisible rules of society were debated and enforced. Fire also kept the monsters at bay. A camp, sleeping out in the open with a roaring blaze, was generally safe from the cave bears, the dire wolves, and the giant hyenas that prowled the darkness. Fire pushed back the shadows, allowing humans to sleep deeply and dream. They also used fire to conquer the landscape itself. They set deliberate, highly controlled brush fires to flush out terrified game, or to clear dead undergrowth so that fresh, green shoots would attract grazing deer the following spring. They held wooden spear tips in the flames to harden the points. In the bitter, freezing winters of the north, a well-tended hearth was quite literally the thin red line between waking up the next morning and freezing solid in your sleep. When it came to keeping the weather out, the popular image of the grunting caveman is only a fraction of the truth. Yes, if a band found a dry, safe cave, they absolutely used it. It was a free fortress. But caves were rare, and they were often already occupied by 1,000-pound bears that did not want to share. Furthermore, a poorly ventilated cave would quickly choke you with the smoke from your own fire. So, your ancestors became architects. The archaeological record proves that human beings have been building their own houses for hundreds of thousands of years, and they were brilliant at it. In the sweltering tropics, they wove elegant, breezy shades out of palm fronds and saplings. In the freezing north, they built heavy, insulated domes of timber wrapped in thick animal hides. In the desolate, frozen steppes of Siberia, where trees simply did not exist, but mammoths were plentiful, they built jaw-dropping fortresses out of bone. They interlocked massive mammoth ribs and tusks to form a skeletal dome, then draped the whole thing in heavy furs, weighing the edges down with mammoth skulls. These were not flimsy tents thrown up in an hour. These were serious, heavy-duty homes. Some sites show evidence of being occupied, abandoned, and repaired by the same families for generations. They had designated sleeping quarters, butchering areas, and stone-lined hearths designed to radiate heat back into the room long after the flames died down. Some even had primitive chimney systems to pull the smoke up and out into the freezing sky. And then there is the clothing, another technology that is vastly older than we give it credit for. We know for an absolute fact that humans were wearing tightly tailored, fitted clothing at least 70,000 years ago. How? Through a brilliant piece of genetic detective work involving lice. The DNA of the lice that live in human clothing split away from the lice that live in human head hair exactly around that time. But the truth is, humans were likely wearing clothes long before that, especially as they pushed up into the freezing latitudes. This was not just tossing a bloody wolfskin over your shoulder. Early clothing was a highly skilled craft. You had to know exactly which animal provided the warmest winter coat and which provided the most breathable summer leather. You had to carefully peel the skin away without nicking it. You had to scrape off the fat and then rub the hide with the animal's own brain tissue, a chemical process that prevented the skin from rotting and turning into a stiff, useless board. You worked the leather until it was as soft as butter. But clothes were more than just wearable blankets. They were the world's first fashion industry. Even in the depths of the Paleolithic, people were decorating their tunics with pierced shells, polished ivory beads, and streaks of red ochre. They engineered distinct tribal styles. When you walked into a clearing and saw a stranger, you could look at the cut of their coat and the beads on their chest and know instantly who their people were. Because here is the deepest, truest fact about Paleolithic life. It was relentlessly, fundamentally social. From the gathering of the nuts, to the hunting of the mammoth, to the sewing of the hides, to the raising of the children. Everything was tangled in a dense web of relationships, favors, and mutual reliance. You did not survive because you were the strongest guy in the valley. You survived because you belonged to a tribe that had your back. The myth of the lone, stoic survivalist conquering the wild by himself is exactly that, a myth. Humans survived together, or they died alone. And these were rich, dramatic, complicated social worlds. They were full of bitter rivalries, deep friendships, scandalous love affairs, and hilarious inside jokes. Your ancestors gossiped. They held grudges. They forgave each other. They were not simple, and they were not primitive. They were entirely, beautifully human, living in a radically different world, using radically different tools. And that world was about to change in ways they could not possibly have dreamed of. So let us look at what happened next. Because roughly 60,000 years ago, a restlessness took hold of a small band of humans living somewhere in the sun-baked savannas of East Africa. They started walking, and they simply never stopped. By the time their distant grandchildren finally dropped their walking sticks, human beings had colonized every single habitable landmass on planet Earth. This is the Great Migration, the pivot point where we stopped being a purely African species and became a global phenomenon. But here is the detail that makes this story so beautifully human. They didn't do it because they were brave explorers. They didn't pack their bags because they were romantically curious about what lay beyond the sunset. They did it because they were pushed. Put yourself in their bare feet. You belong to a band of maybe 40 people living near the coast of what we now call Ethiopia or Somalia. Your bloodline has hunted this stretch of coastline for 100 generations. You know the exact bend in the river where the antelope drink. You know the exact week the wild figs turn sweet. This is your home. But slowly, imperceptibly, year after year, the math stops working. The climate is shifting again. Not a world-ending apocalypse, but enough to make the dry seasons bite a little harder. The rains become fickle, the reliable herds thin out, and crucially, the human population is quietly swelling. Because your people have gotten incredibly good at staying alive. The sharpened spears, the woven nets, the deep social networks, all these innovations are working. More babies are surviving to adulthood, which means there are more mouths to feed, and more hunters chasing the same vanishing antelope. So a splinter group makes a heavy decision. They start edging toward the absolute fringes of their known map. And eventually, perhaps by sheer accident, perhaps driven by desperation, they cross a narrow, swirling strait of salt water, separating Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. It is not an impossible distance, maybe 20 miles across at its tightest choke point. On a clear, bright morning, you can actually see the mountains of the other side. They likely lash together simple rafts of dry reeds or floating logs. Nothing elegant. Just enough buoyancy to keep their heads above the tide. And suddenly, they drag themselves onto the shores of an alien world. The Arabian Peninsula, 60,000 years ago, looked absolutely nothing like the scorching dunes we know today. It was a lush, temperate paradise. There were deep lakes, winding rivers, and rolling grasslands heavily stocked with game that had never learned to fear the two-legged ape with the sharp stick. And most importantly, there were no other humans, no rival bands defending their borders. Just an endless, silent buffet waiting to be claimed. For a small band of exhausted refugees, it was the Garden of Eden. So they stayed. They built their fires, they had children, and those children grew strong and pushed a few miles further up the beach. This cycle repeated itself rhythmically, generation after generation. Pushing a few miles further into the unknown, but always keeping the ocean over their shoulder. Because the coast is a cheat code for survival. This is known as the coastal migration theory, and it is backed up by both our DNA and the dirt. These early pioneers did not immediately march into the deep, terrifying heart of Asia. They hugged the beaches. They walked the sand, living off a highly predictable diet of clams, seabirds, and whatever terrestrial game they could spear just inland. It was a deeply conservative strategy, but it was brilliant. If you follow the coast, you can never truly get lost. You always have food at your feet, and you always have a horizon to follow. And they moved fast. Well, fast in the grand, slow crawl of geological time. In perhaps 10 or 15,000 years, their descendants had walked all the way to Australia. That is an 8,000-mile journey from their starting line in Africa. They walked the entire southern rim of Asia, down through what is now India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. And then, standing on the edge of the world, they did something that defies belief. They built boats capable of surviving the open, violent ocean. Because here is the geographical reality of Australia. There is no land bridge. There has never been a land bridge, not even during the deepest freeze of the Ice Age, when the oceans were sucked up into the glaciers. The gap between Indonesia and Australia has always been at least 60 miles of deep, churning blue water. You cannot see the other side. You cannot island hop your way to safety. At some point, you have to push a raft off the sand and commit to the open sea, sailing into a horizon where there is nothing but water in every direction. This requires a level of cognitive brilliance that scientists used to think early humans simply did not possess. You have to understand the stars to navigate. You have to read the invisible currents of the water and the shifting patterns of the weather. You have to engineer a watercraft tough enough not to shatter in the swells. You have to stockpile fresh water for a journey that could take days. And you have to have the breathtaking courage, or perhaps the blinding desperation, to sail into the absolute void with zero guarantee that you won't just drift until you die of thirst. But they did it. At least 65,000 years ago, human footprints pressed into the sands of Australia. We know this because we have found their campfires, their stone blades, the scattered bones of their meals. The physical echoes of a people who pulled off one of the greatest maritime voyages in the history of our planet, using tools the textbooks call primitive. And once they hit the Australian beaches, they exploded across the continent. In just a few thousand years, they adapted from the steaming tropical north to the chilly temperate south. From the coastal reefs to the brutal, bone-dry heart of the outback. They were facing environments that were completely alien to anything their African ancestors had ever seen. They faced massive, bizarre marsupials that existed nowhere else on Earth. They encountered toxic plants that required entirely new methods of preparation. They even had to adapt to seasons that were completely flipped from the northern hemisphere. They figured it all out. They learned the rhythms of the new beasts. They found the hidden water in the cracked earth. In a matter of dozens of generations, they had engineered entirely new toolkits and social codes perfectly calibrated to the Australian wild. This is the ultimate signature of the human animal. Drop us into any environment on Earth, give us a little time, and we will not just survive, we will own it. But while some bands were sailing into Australia, others had taken a different fork in the road. Some of those original migrants had lingered in the Middle East. Instead of hugging the beach toward the rising sun, they turned north, walking up into the Levant, what is today Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And there, roughly 60,000 years ago, they bumped into something completely unexpected. Other humans. But humans who looked different. Humans who had thicker brows, heavier bones, and who spoke in tongues that sounded like nothing they had ever heard. The Neanderthals. Remember, the Neanderthals were not clumsy, grunting apes. They were highly intelligent, apex predators who had owned Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were perfectly dialed in to their environment. And suddenly, these tall, slender African migrants are walking into their valleys. What happened next permanently altered the genetic code of humanity. Because instead of an immediate apocalyptic race war, instead of one species simply slaughtering the other, something far more intimate happened. They interbred. We know this with absolute certainty because every single modern human alive today with non-African ancestry carries a whisper of Neanderthal DNA in their blood. It isn't a lot, usually around 2%, but it is undeniable, physical proof of campfires shared, of relationships forged in the cold, of children born to mixed parents. The DNA tells us this wasn't a one-time accident. This was a prolonged, complex intermingling between two distinct human species over thousands of years. And they traded more than just genes. The humans pushing into Europe show signs of copying Neanderthal technology, adopting heavier tools, and mimicking local hunting tactics. And late Neanderthal campsites occasionally show delicate, refined tools that look suspiciously like the handiwork of modern humans. It was a cultural cross-pollination. Two apex predators watching each other, stealing each other's best ideas, and adapting them to survive. But it was not a peaceful utopia. They were competing. Both species needed the exact same caves to sleep in, They both needed to spear the exact same reindeer to feed their children. And as the modern humans pushed deeper and deeper into the European continent, the Neanderthal populations slowly began to suffocate. Not overnight, not in a sudden flash of violence, but a slow, agonizing fade over thousands of years. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were backed into isolated, lonely corners of southern Europe. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone. Did our ancestors hunt them down? Did we simply outbreed and out-eat them? Did we carry tropical diseases in our lungs that their immune systems couldn't fight? We don't know for sure. It was likely a messy combination of all three. What we do know is that modern humans walked out of that icy crucible alive, and the Neanderthals did not. But they did not vanish completely. They left their ghosts in our DNA, a permanent reminder that we are not a purebred species, but a patchwork hybrid of ancient survivors. While this slow-motion tragedy was playing out in the European snow, other human bands were still pushing the boundaries of the map. Some walked up into the high, thin air of Central Asia, where they collided with yet another human species, the Denisovans. More campfires shared, more genetic trading. Today, modern populations in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA, sometimes making up to 5% of their genome. And these genes were incredibly useful. That ability to breathe easily in the oxygen-starved heights of the Himalayas, you can thank a Denisovan ancestor for that. The genetic mutation that allows modern Tibetan populations to thrive at punishing altitudes was a direct gift from this vanished species. 50,000 years after they first left Africa, human bands were pushing further north and further east, chasing the massive herds of mammoth and bison into environments that were growing increasingly brutal. By 45,000 years ago, they were standing above the Arctic Circle. By 30,000 years ago, they were surviving the Siberian winters. Winters so profoundly cold, they would kill a modern human in a matter of hours without specialized gear. But they didn't freeze. They engineered heavy, multi-layered fur clothing. They learned how to build insulated subterranean homes out of mammoth bone and earth. They invented entirely new ways to exist in a landscape that actively wanted them dead. And they kept walking. Because during the deepest freezes of the Ice Age, so much of the Earth's water was locked up in the glaciers that the global sea level plummeted. This massive drain exposed a wide, grassy land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. A stretch of freezing tundra 1,000 miles wide that geologists call Beringia. And sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, small bands of humans, wrapped in furs, walked across that bridge and stepped into the Americas. Scientists used to argue bitterly about exactly when this happened, but the dirt and the DNA keep pushing the date further back. What we know now is that once they arrived, they exploded southward with breathtaking speed. In the span of perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 years, human footprints stretched from the icy crags of Alaska all the way down to the windswept tip of South America. That is a 10,000-mile march in less than 100 generations. It is one of the most rapid, aggressive territorial expansions in the history of biology. And just like they had done everywhere else, they adapted instantly. They mastered the dense pine forests of North America. They conquered the suffocating, humid jungles of Central America. They learned to breathe in the Andes and hunt in the Amazon. They invented new blades to kill strange new beasts. By 12,000 years ago, humans were standing on the beaches of Tierra del Fuego, staring out at the dark waters of the Antarctic Ocean. From the savannas of East Africa to the absolute bottom of the world, we had colonized every habitable rock on the planet. We had expanded from the steaming equator to the frozen poles, from the sea-level beaches to the clouds of the high mountains. We were finally a global species. But here is the detail that should make you pause. This entire staggering process, from the first raft crossing the Red Sea to the final footprints in South America, took roughly 50,000 years. 600 centuries. That is unbelievably, agonizingly slow. If a band of modern humans really wanted to, they could walk from Africa to Argentina in a few years. Even accounting for mountains and swamps, it could be done in a decade. So why did it take your ancestors 50,000 years? Because they were not trying to explore. They were trying to survive. A band would find a valley that had enough deer and enough water, and they would simply stop. They would live there for 1,000 years. They only moved when they were forced to. When the population grew too large for the valley to feed, or when the climate shifted and the deer vanished, a small group would break off and reluctantly walk a few miles to the next valley. The Great Migration was a slow, dripping bleed of human bodies pushed outward by necessity, not by wanderlust. And this deep conservatism was incredibly smart. If you have spent 50 generations learning exactly how to survive in your specific forest, leaving that forest is a massive gamble. Walking into a new territory means you don't know which plants are poisonous. You don't know where the leopards hunt. Your elders cannot guide you because they have never seen this dirt either. Every time you move, you risk starvation. So you only move when staying put becomes a guaranteed death sentence. But the DNA tells us one more beautiful truth about this global spread. Even as they scattered across the continents, these human populations never fully broke the invisible threads connecting them. We can see it in the genes. Tiny trickles of DNA flowing between tribes separated by thousands of miles. Proof of deep, sprawling trade networks. Proof that teenagers were leaving their home camps to marry into neighboring tribes. Proof that ideas, stories, and tools were still being whispered across the vastness of the earth. The human expansion was not a single line marching blindly forward. It was a stretching, breathing web of interconnected families. And that web was about to become the most important technology of all. Because the next chapter of the human story was no longer just about staying alive. It was about creating something that had never existed in the universe before. Culture, art, the breathtaking ability to close your eyes, imagine something that isn't real, and then force it into existence. That is where the story turns next. Now, we have to talk about a moment that will fundamentally rewrite how you understand what it means to be a human being. Because roughly 40,000 years ago, something breathtaking happened in the dark. Your ancestors, these hardened, pragmatic survivors who had weathered ice ages, dodged megafauna, and clawed their way back from the brink of extinction, suddenly started doing something that had never been done in the history of life on Earth. They started making art. Not just scratching lines on a rock, not just random doodles. They began creating sophisticated, intentional, emotionally shattering masterpieces. that would literally bring tears to your eyes if you stood in front of them today. The proof is everywhere, once you know where to shine the light. Deep in the limestone arteries of southern France, in the twisting, lightless caves of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, your ancestors crawled underground. They carried flickering lamps made of animal fat pooled in hollow stones. And they began to paint. Massive, thundering horses galloping across the curving stone. Herds of heavy-shouldered bison charging in the dark. Pride of lions caught mid-hunt. Towering bears standing on their hind legs. The images are so electric, so vibrating with kinetic energy and life, that modern art students still study them to understand composition and form. But here is the detail that will stop your heart. These were not the crude stick figures of amateurs trying to pass the time on a rainy afternoon. These were the works of absolute masters, individuals who possessed a deep, intuitive grasp of perspective and shading. They deliberately used the natural, bulging contours of the cave walls to give their paintings a three-dimensional depth. When the orange light of their fat lamps flickered and danced, the shadows moved across the painted muscles, making it look as though the massive beasts were physically breathing, physically running through the rock. These people were artists in the truest, heaviest sense of the word. They were trained. They were specialists who likely spent their entire lives perfecting the flick of their wrists. And they were doing this in the most remote, terrifyingly dark chambers of these cave systems. Places you had to squeeze your chest through suffocating, narrow tunnels just to reach. Places that took hours of crawling away from the safety of the sun. Places that were completely divorced from the practical, sunlit world of hunting and gathering. Why? This is the question that haunts every archaeologist who stands in those silent rooms. Why would people living on the razor's edge of starvation, people who had to bleed and sweat every single day just to put meat in their children's mouths, spend massive amounts of time and precious calories crawling into the dangerous dark to paint beautiful things that almost no one would ever see? The answer tells us everything about what had shifted inside the human mind. Your ancestors had fully unlocked the power of symbolic thought. They had developed the ability to see profound meaning layered over the physical world. That painted horse on the wall was not just a horse. It was an idea. It was a story. Perhaps it was a desperate prayer to the spirits of the earth for a successful hunt. It was undeniable proof that human beings had learned to live in two realities at the same exact time. The physical world of hunger and cold, and the invisible, mental world of meaning and myth. But the cave walls were just the canvas. Evidence from digs across Africa, Europe, and Asia shows that humans of this era became wildly obsessed with personal decoration. They began adorning themselves, not to stay warm, but to look beautiful, to signal social status, to broadcast their tribal identity, or simply for the pure, aesthetic joy of it. Ochre, that deep red mineral pigment, starts appearing in archaeological sites in massive industrial quantities. Tons of it, ground down into a fine powder and mixed with animal fat or water to create vibrant paint. But they weren't just painting the caves anymore. They were painting themselves. They painted their faces, their chests, their leather clothing. They were inventing the world's first cosmetics, the first makeup, the first fashion trends. We have found burials from this era where the dead were covered in so much powdered ochre that the soil around their bones is still stained blood red 30,000 years later. This was not an accident. It was a deeply intentional, highly ritualized act. These people were making a loud, visual statement about exactly who they were. And then come the beads. Thousands upon thousands of delicate beads, carved from seashells, river stones, animal bone, and mammoth ivory. Every single bead required hours of patient, agonizing labor to drill and polish. They were strung together into heavy necklaces, woven into bracelets, and sewn directly into their garments. Some individuals were laid to rest, wearing beadwork so impossibly elaborate that it must have represented years of accumulated wealth and status. And they didn't just paint and carve, they played. Because yes, your ancestors were making music. We have pulled bone flutes from the dirt of Europe, carved from the hollow wing bones of massive birds and the ivory of mammoths, dating back 40,000 years. These are not crude whistles that just make a loud noise. These are precisely engineered instruments. The finger holes are mathematically spaced to produce specific, deliberate notes. It proves that the human ear had already grasped the concepts of pitch, scale, and melody. If you listen to a modern replica of one of these ancient flutes being played, it is a haunting, beautiful sound. The melodies are simple, but they are undeniably music. They are the exact same foundational scales that would eventually give birth to every musical tradition on Earth. Picture your ancestors sitting shoulder to shoulder around a roaring fire on a freezing prehistoric night. Someone is playing the bone flute. People are singing. Perhaps they are dancing, stomping their feet in the dust, creating beauty simply because it feels good to be alive. But the most profound cultural leap of this era was something quieter, more intimate, and ultimately more revealing of our deep emotional complexity. The way they treated their dead. Human beings had been putting bodies in the ground for a long time. The Neanderthals did it. Early modern humans did it. But around 40,000 years ago, burials became something else entirely. They became elaborate, ritualized, and heavy with a grief we can still feel today. Bodies were not just tossed into a hole, they were carefully arranged, often placed in the fetal position, curled up as if waiting to be born again. They were aligned to face specific directions, perhaps looking toward the rising sun or a sacred mountain. And they were buried with grave goods, heavy spears, delicate bone tools, beautiful jewelry, and cuts of meat, provisions for a journey. This means your ancestors had conceptualized an afterlife. They had reached the stunning conclusion that death was not a wall, but a door, that the person they loved was going somewhere else, and they would need their tools when they got there. This is highly sophisticated, abstract philosophy. It is the absolute dawn of religion. Some of these graves break your heart with their complexity. In a famous site in Russia, 2 young children were buried side by side. They were covered from head to toe in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, surrounded by beautiful, intricate sculptures. The sheer amount of human labor required to carve those beads is staggering. Months, perhaps years of back-breaking work. All of it buried in the dark, with 2 children who died too young to have ever contributed to the survival of the tribe. That tells us something beautiful. These people loved their children, not just as future hunters or gatherers, but as individual souls worthy of immense honor and memory. They felt a grief so deep it demanded to be materialized in ivory and stone. They believed human life had an inherent sacred dignity, and they were likely exploring the edges of their own minds too, engaging in what anthropologists loosely call shamanism, though that word barely captures the magic of it. They were chasing trance states, altered states of consciousness, spiritual experiences that felt more vivid than the waking world. The cave art leaves us clues. We see strange, impossible hybrids painted in the dark, figures with the bodies of men and the heads of stags, beings that do not exist in the sunlit world, swirling geometric grids that mirror the visual hallucinations of a deep trance. We find handprints, hundreds of them, left by people who placed their palms against the cold stone and blew red paint over them, as if they were trying to reach through the rock into another dimension. Many scholars now believe those suffocating, echoing chambers deep underground were sensory deprivation tanks used for intense rituals. A shaman, or a spiritual guide, would crawl into the pitch black, perhaps using rhythmic, hypnotic drumming, chanting, or even psychoactive plants to crack open their own mind. In that altered state, they saw visions, spirit animals, ancient ancestors, the glowing, hidden skeleton of the universe. And when they woke up, they painted exactly what they had seen onto the rock, creating a permanent map of their spiritual journey. This was not ignorant superstition. This was the systematic exploration of human consciousness. Your ancestors had realized that the mind was a flexible thing, that there were other ways to perceive reality beyond just looking at a tree or a rock. And they used those altered states to seek wisdom, to heal their sick, and to speak to whatever they believed was listening in the dark. But perhaps the most powerful cultural technology they invented left absolutely no physical trace in the dirt. Storytelling. The oral traditions that carried the survival data of the tribe across the chasm of time. The stories that transformed one person's lucky escape from a lion into the collective wisdom of the entire band. Every single culture we know of has origin myths. Stories about how the stars were hung, how the rivers were carved, and why the bear has a short tail. These mythologies almost certainly crystallized during this era, passed from the lips of a grandfather to the ears of a child, generation after generation. We know that some indigenous Australian oral traditions accurately describe geological shifts and rising sea levels that occurred 10,000 years ago. They kept the data perfectly intact for 400 generations through the power of narrative. Your ancestors were doing the exact same thing. They were weaving their survival protocols into unforgettable campfire tales. They were binding their tribes together with shared histories. Language had evolved from a way to shout, "Look out for the snake," into a sophisticated technology for storing and transmitting the human soul. And then there are the Paleolithic Venus figurines. Small, palm-sized sculptures of women found scattered across the dirt of Europe and Asia, dating back 20 to 30,000 years. They are instantly recognizable. Female bodies with heavily exaggerated features, massive breasts, wide hips, swollen bellies, usually lacking faces or feet. No one knows exactly what they meant. Were they fertility idols meant to bring healthy pregnancies? Were they the first depictions of an earth goddess? Were they anatomical teaching tools for prehistoric midwives? The fact that the exact same stylistic figures pop up thousands of miles apart proves they carried a massive, shared cultural weight. Some scholars argue they represent a deep, ancient religion centered entirely on the sacred power of female fertility and the cycles of birth. Others suggest they are simply realistic portraits of well-fed women in an age where surviving the winter with extra body fat was a miracle worth carving into stone. Some even argue they are self-portraits, carved by pregnant women looking down at their own changing bodies without a mirror. What we know for sure is that your ancestors were thinking deeply and symbolically about reproduction, about womanhood, and about the sheer, terrifying miracle of creating new life. All of these beautiful things, the art, the bone flutes, the beadwork, the tears shed over a grave, the campfire stories, they were not random hobbies. They were the visible symptoms of a fundamental rewiring of the human brain. Your ancestors had learned to think in the abstract, to build a culture that could stack upon itself, growing richer and heavier with each passing generation. And that changed the math of human survival forever. Because once you can think in symbols, once you can bind 50 people together with a shared myth or a sacred dance, you can coordinate human behavior on a scale that biology alone could never achieve. You can build trust with a total stranger simply because he wears the same carved shell necklace that you do. You can stockpile knowledge that outlives the oldest elder. You can motivate a group to endure terrible suffering today for the promise of a better tomorrow. This was the true birth of human culture. Not just clever apes mimicking each other, but a living, breathing system of meaning that existed entirely in the imagination. A system that could evolve and mutate 1,000,000 times faster than our DNA. Your ancestors were no longer just trying to avoid being eaten. They were building universes of meaning. They were exploring the spirit, the mind, and the canvas. They were becoming, in every sense of the word, us. And they were going to need every ounce of that new cultural brilliance. Because the next great test was coming. And this time, it wasn't about surviving a glacier. It was about solving the most dangerous puzzle in the history of our species. How to pack thousands of human beings into one place without them tearing each other apart. They were about to build the foundations of civilization. Here is a fact that should stagger your modern mind. Your ancestors spent 90,000 years walking the earth before they ever planted a single field. And for the vast, overwhelming majority of that time, they essentially used the exact same basic stone toolkit. Hand axes, hide scrapers, simple spear points. Generation after generation, millennium after millennium, someone would sit by a fire and chip the exact same shape into a piece of flint that their great-great-great-grandfather had chipped. To our modern brains, which are addicted to the frantic dopamine drip of software updates and next-generation gadgets, this sounds completely insane. Why didn't they innovate faster? Why did progress crawl at such an agonizing, microscopic pace? But here is the brilliant, brutal logic of the Paleolithic world. When you are living on the absolute razor's edge of starvation, innovation is terrifying. You have a set of tools and a rhythm of life that works. It kept your family breathing through the freezing winter and the scorching summer. Every single person in your camp knows exactly how to make that spear, how to throw it, and how to fix it when it snaps. Now, imagine you are a creative genius, who suddenly invents a radically new way to hunt. Something no one has ever seen before. It might work better, but if it fails, if your new invention breaks when the bison charges, you don't just lose a patent, you die, and your children starve. In a world where one bad week of hunting means the end of your bloodline, being a reckless innovator is not bravery, it is suicide. So progress happened with agonizing caution. It moved at the speed of safety. An idea was only adopted when the immediate benefit was so undeniably massive that it outshone the risk of changing the old ways. But when those rare innovations finally broke through, they were not just minor upgrades. They were absolute revolutions that changed the trajectory of the human species. Take the spear thrower, or the atlatl. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans hunted by thrusting heavy spears. That meant you had to creep up to a massive, terrified animal until you were close enough to smell its breath, close enough to drive a stick into its ribs, close enough for it to whip its head around and gore you with its antlers, or crush your skull with a hoof. The mortality rate for hunters was staggering. The bone record is full of shattered femurs, snapped ribs, and deep puncture wounds. Hunting was the most dangerous thing a human being could do, and they had to do it constantly. Then, roughly 75,000 years ago, someone carved a piece of wood with a hook on the end. The atlatl. It acts as an artificial extension of your arm, giving you a massive mechanical lever. Simple physics, but a biological miracle. Suddenly, with a flick of your wrist, you could launch a lighter spear with 3 times the force, hitting a target 30 or 40 feet away. You could kill from a distance. The danger did not vanish, but it plummeted, and it unlocked a new menu. With that kind of velocity and range, you could suddenly bring down smaller, faster animals, birds, fast deer, nimble gazelles, that were nearly impossible to ambush with a thrusting spear. Your diet expanded, your children grew fatter, your odds of survival skyrocketed. But here is the wild part. The atlatl did not go viral. The dirt tells us it took thousands of years for this miracle weapon to slowly bleed from one region to the next. Why? Because you couldn't just pick one up and use it. It required an entirely new, deeply unnatural throwing motion that took years of muscle memory to master. It required the entire hunting party to change their tactics. It required convincing your stubborn elders to waste precious daylight practicing a new trick when the old spears still drew blood. Innovation wasn't just about having a genius idea. It was a grueling campaign of cultural persuasion. The bow and arrow arrived much later, likely around 30,000 years ago. It offered even greater miracles: rapid fire, pinpoint accuracy from the shadows, and lightweight ammunition. But it demanded an insanely complex manufacturing ecosystem. You needed supple, springy wood for the bow stave. You needed to twist animal sinew or plant fibers into a bowstring that wouldn't snap under tension. You needed perfectly straight, aerodynamically balanced wooden shafts. You needed to glue feathers to the back so it would spin in flight. Making a bow and arrow meant you couldn't just be a guy who hit rocks together. You had to be a botanist, a Fletcher, and an engineer. Technology was becoming specialized. Which brings us to the microliths. This is where human engineering gets truly beautiful. Around 70,000 years ago, humans stopped trying to make one big, perfect tool. Instead, They started napping tiny, razor-sharp, geometric flakes of stone. Triangles and crescents, no bigger than your fingernail. These were not tools themselves. They were modular components. They would take a long piece of wood or bone, carve a groove down the side, and glue a dozen of these tiny stone teeth into the slot, using heated pine resin. They created serrated knives, jagged harvesting sickles, and barbed harpoons. If you hit a bone and chipped a blade, you didn't throw the whole knife away. You just melted the resin, popped out the broken tooth, and glued a new one in. It is the birth of interchangeable parts. It requires a mind that can plan steps ahead, visualize a composite structure, and standardize manufacturing. We have found ancient campsites that were essentially microlith factories, where skilled craftsmen sat in the dirt, mass-producing tiny blades to trade across the valley. It was the dawn of specialized industry. But the most earth-shattering technological leap of this entire era is the one you can't see in a museum, because it rotted away. I am talking about string, rope, the invisible revolution of woven fiber that changed absolutely everything. Just think about what you can do with a good piece of rope. You can lash logs together to build a raft. You can weave a net to pull 100 fish out of the river at once. You can set invisible snares in the brush to choke a rabbit. You can tie the heavy wooden beams of a winter shelter so they don't collapse in the wind. You can strap a heavy load of firewood to your back. You can harness a sled and drag a dead mammoth across the snow. Every single one of these abilities unlocks a totally new way to conquer the environment. Coastal tribes with woven nets could suddenly pull massive calories out of the deep water. Arctic tribes with sleds could follow the reindeer herds across endless miles of ice. Island hoppers could lash outriggers together and sail past the horizon. The tragedy is that plant fibers decay. We only get fleeting ghost-like glimpses of this technology in the dirt. A tiny fragment of braided cord preserved in a waterlogged cave, or the faint woven imprint of a basket pressed into wet clay. But the DNA tells a stunning story. Around 50 or 60,000 years ago, human populations showed genetic shifts favoring increased manual dexterity and finger strength. Natural selection was actively rewarding the humans who were best at twisting tiny fibers together. Making string was so vital to keeping your children alive that it literally altered the physical evolution of our hands. And that rope made the boats possible. It is incredibly hard to prove when humans first built boats, because dugout logs and reed rafts do not survive for 50,000 years. But we don't need the boats to prove they existed. We have the footprints they left behind on shores they never should have reached. Human beings were living on islands that were never ever connected to the mainland, even when the oceans were at their absolute lowest. The only way to get there was to float. And as we discussed with Australia, they weren't just splashing around in the shallows, they were navigating the deep blue. This meant coastal tribes could bypass the brutal, tangled jungles of the interior and simply glide down the coastline, hauling heavy loads of meat and tools with a fraction of the effort. They became the first mariners. When the ice caps eventually melted and the oceans rose, those ancient coastal highways were swallowed by the sea. There are likely entire chapters of human brilliance, thriving coastal villages and maritime cultures sitting right now under 300 feet of dark water. Around 30,000 years ago, your ancestors pulled off a diplomatic miracle. They forged an alliance with a completely different species, the wolves that would become our dogs. We will never know exactly how the first spark was struck. Perhaps a pack of curious, less aggressive wolves started lingering at the edge of the firelight, scavenging the cracked mammoth bones we threw into the dark. Perhaps a human hunter found a den of orphaned pups and carried them back to the children. It was likely a messy, chaotic process filled with bitten hands and failed experiments. But the DNA confirms that by 30,000 years ago, there were canines walking the earth that were genetically distinct from wild wolves. They had been warped and softened by the gravity of human society. This partnership was an unfair advantage. Dogs could smell a hidden deer that a human could never see. They could hear the soft padding of a cave bear creeping toward the camp at midnight. They could track a bleeding bison across miles of hard rock. They were early warning systems, hunting partners, and living, breathing space heaters on a freezing night. In exchange, we gave them a warm fire, a steady supply of meat, and scratched them behind the ears. It was the first time in the history of the planet that a human species co-evolved with another apex predator. We shaped their bodies and their minds, and in return, they made us undisputed masters of the wild. But perhaps the most quiet, underrated genius of this era was the invention of the pantry, the technology of storage, leather sacks, woven baskets, and wooden bowls. It sounds incredibly boring until you realize what storage actually does to time. It allows you to separate the act of finding food from the act of eating it. It allows you to survive a brutal, dead winter by eating the hard work you did in the autumn. Storage completely rewired how humans interacted with the landscape. Instead of wandering aimlessly every day hoping to spot a deer, you could plan. You could set up camp next to a river for 3 weeks during the massive salmon run, smoke and dry thousands of pounds of fish, pack it into baskets, and live like royalty when the snow began to fall. Around 50,000 years ago, the dirt shows us that humans were setting up seasonal base camps. They were digging deep storage pits into the permafrost to act as prehistoric freezers. They were building raised wooden platforms to keep the scavengers away from their dried meat. This is the absolute beginning of settling down. It is the prologue to the city. Because once you have a ton of food buried in the ground, you can't just walk away from it. You have to stay and defend it. And to do that, you need the technology of preservation. You have to know how to dry meat in the wind, how to smoke it over the fire, and perhaps even how to ferment things. You have to know how to save today to survive tomorrow. And then there is the dark art of poison, the birth of prehistoric chemistry. Somewhere along the line, a brilliant, observant human realized that the sap of a certain vine or the sweat of a brightly colored frog could drop a massive animal faster than a sharp rock ever could. We have found stone points dating back 40,000 years with tiny, deliberate grooves carved into them. Gutters designed to hold a sticky, toxic paste. Chemical analysis of ancient weapons has revealed the ghostly residue of plant alkaloids. But think about the terrifying trial and error required to master this. You had to identify the exact toxic leaf in a forest of thousands. You had to know whether to boil it, crush it, or dry it. If you made the paste too weak, the animal ran away. If you made it too strong, you poisoned the meat and killed your own family. It was a high-stakes, lethal science, perfected over centuries of observation and passed down with absolute, unforgiving precision. So we return to the great question. Why did all of this take so long? Why did 90,000 years bleed away between the dawn of modern humans and the first fields of wheat? Because, as we have seen, a successful survival strategy is inherently stubborn. If your spears and your baskets are keeping your children fed, you do not mess with the formula. You teach your daughters exactly what your mother taught you. Innovation only sparks when the old ways fail, when the ice advances, when the herds die off, when the neighboring tribe pushes you out of your valley. You only risk trying something new when the danger of staying the same becomes greater than the danger of the unknown. And here is the beautiful, humbling truth about prehistoric technology. It wasn't primitive, it was perfect. These people were not bumbling fools waiting for the future to arrive. They were highly sophisticated engineers, thriving with toolkits that were flawlessly optimized for their reality. They pulled more nutrition out of the wild with less physical labor than the early farmers ever did. They had more free time, stronger bones, and fewer diseases. The slow crawl of progress wasn't slow because they were dim-witted. It was slow because for the vast majority of human history, there was absolutely no reason to rush. Life was brutal, yes, but it was incredibly stable. The tools worked. The stories held the tribe together. The generations turned over like leaves falling from a tree. Innovation happened at the exact, precise speed it needed to. But this beautiful, conservative, deeply successful way of life was about to hit a wall. Because all of these slow, quiet innovations, the baskets, the dogs, the microliths, the social networks, were quietly stacking up. They were laying the invisible groundwork for something their inventors could never have imagined. The trap of civilization was set, and the trigger was about to be pulled. Here is a reality that will make you look at the strangers walking past you on the street very differently. For 90,000 years, your ancestors lived in groups of about 25 to 50 people. That was it. That was your entire universe. Every single person you would ever love, every person you would ever hate, every person you would ever share a meal with, or fight for a mate with, could comfortably fit inside a modern coffee shop. But here is the magic of it. They were not alone. These tiny, intimate bands of humans were scattered across the staggering immensity of the continents, separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of wild earth. And yet, they were connected. They passed beautiful shells to people they had never seen. They swapped stories about mountains they had never climbed. They spoke words that had drifted across rivers they had never crossed. Using nothing but their feet and their voices, they built an invisible, pulsing network that stretched across the habitable globe. How on earth did they do it? How did people who might only see 100 faces in their entire lifetime maintain relationships across distances that took months to walk? The answer is a masterpiece of social engineering. A system so elegant and so perfectly adapted to the wild that modern sociologists are still marveling at it. It starts with the band, the core unit. Those 30 or so people bound tightly by blood and marriage. This is the family that hunted the mammoth, carried the children, and kept the fire burning in the dark. A band operates on a level of intimacy that modern humans have entirely lost. In a group that small, everyone knows everything. They don't just know your name. They know exactly how you react when you are terrified. They know if you are generous with your meat, or if you hide the best cuts for yourself. They know who reads the clouds to predict the rain, who can calm a furious argument, and who tells the best jokes when the winter wind is howling. This hyper-intimacy created the ultimate social safety net: absolute accountability. You cannot be a lazy grifter in a band of 30 people. You cannot fake being good at tracking a deer. If you don't pull your weight, everyone sees it. If you cause unnecessary drama, there is nowhere to hide. But our ancestors were brilliant enough to realize a terrifying biological truth. If your little band of 30 people isolates itself in a beautiful valley and never speaks to outsiders, you will eventually die. Isolation is an evolutionary death sentence. Enter the gift economy. This was the circulatory system of the Paleolithic world. The beautiful, highly ritualized mechanism that pumped goods, ideas, and genetic diversity across the continents. Imagine your band lives by a river, choking with fat salmon. 2 weeks walk away, there is another band that controls a rocky ridge full of flawless, razor-sharp flint. You need their stone to make your spears. They need your fish to survive the winter. But there is no money. There are no marketplaces. There are no contracts. How do you trade? You give a gift. A group of your best hunters walks the 2 weeks to the rocky ridge. They do not bring weapons raised. They bring carefully smoked, beautiful cuts of salmon. They present it to the elders of the other band. There is no haggling. There is no bartering over exchange rates. It is simply a gift, freely given, wrapped in ceremony and respect. But the invisible ledger has been written. Because 6 months later, when your tool makers are running low on blades, you walk back to that ridge, and the other band greets you with a gift of their absolute finest flint. The gift is not a transaction. It is a handshake. It acknowledges the relationship. It builds a bridge of trust that might be called upon years later by children who haven't even been born yet, during a brutal famine. These networks of obligation stretched for thousands of miles. The dirt proves it. We find volcanic obsidian resting in the soil of plains that have never seen a volcano. We find seashells buried in the deep interior of continents. But these trails carried more than just rocks and shells. They carried the news. When these bands met to exchange gifts, they sat by the fire and traded data. They warned each other about a valley where the lions had grown too bold. They taught each other a new way to carve a bone hook. They mapped the shifting climate. Every interaction was a software update for the human mind. And most vitally, these networks carried genes. Because if a band of 30 people only ever marries within its own camp, the math gets dark very quickly. Inbreeding takes hold. Fertility crashes. The immune system weakens. The band quietly fades into the dust. Your ancestors understood this. Perhaps not the biology of it, but they felt the truth of it in their bones. So they engineered the rule of exogamy. You must marry outside the band. Once or twice a year, when the herds were thick and the foraging was easy, multiple bands would converge on a shared hunting ground. It was a massive, chaotic festival. There was dancing, feasting, and the trading of gifts. And it was here that the young people would lock eyes across the fire. They would fall in love or form a partnership. and one of them would have to do something incredibly brave. They would have to pack their few belongings, wave goodbye to the only family they had ever known, and walk away with a group of strangers. They would integrate into a new camp that might speak a slightly different dialect, sing different songs, and nap their flint a little differently. It must have been terrifying and heartbreaking, but it was the ultimate sacrifice for the survival of the species. It kept the bloodlines vibrant, and it wove the scattered bands together with the unbreakable threads of marriage and in-laws. But what happens when things go wrong? Because humans are humans. There will always be jealousy, stolen meat, and bitter arguments over where to pitch the tents. How do you maintain law and order without police, without judges, and without prisons? In a modern city of millions, we use cold, impersonal institutions. In a band of 30, they used something far more elegant: social pressure, elder mediation, and the terrifying threat of exile. Most arguments were smothered before they could spark a fire. The elders, the grandmothers and grandfathers who had seen 100 petty squabbles, stepped in. Not as judges slamming a gavel, but as diplomats. Their goal wasn't to punish the guilty. Their goal was to restore the peace. Because a band divided by hatred cannot successfully hunt a mammoth. But what about the truly dark crimes? Murder, violence, actions that threaten the actual survival of the group. For that, they used ostracism, the ultimate penalty. If you pushed the tribe too far, they didn't lock you in a cage. They simply turned their backs on you and told you to walk away. In the Paleolithic world, being cast out of the warmth of the fire was a near certain death sentence. You would starve, or the wolves would find you in the dark. The sheer existential terror of being exiled kept the darkest human impulses tightly in check. Leadership in this world was equally fluid and deeply practical. There were no kings. There were no inherited crowns. You couldn't demand respect just because your father was a great man. Leadership had to be earned every single day through pure competence. If you were the guy who could track a wounded deer across hard rock, the band followed you on the hunt. But when it was time to decide which valley to migrate to for the winter, the band stopped listening to the hunter and turned to the old woman who remembered the weather patterns of the last 40 years. Authority shifted depending on the crisis. It was a true meritocracy. You led by serving, by sharing your meat, and by keeping a cool head when the brush caught fire. And speaking of the elders, we must talk about the grandmothers. In almost every other mammalian species on Earth, a female dies shortly after she loses the ability to reproduce. Biology is cruel. It doesn't waste calories on a body that can't make babies. But human women routinely live for decades after menopause. Why? Anthropologists call it the grandmother hypothesis. These older women became the ultimate cheat code for human survival. They didn't have to carry infants of their own anymore, which meant they could focus entirely on gathering massive amounts of roots and berries to feed their daughters' children. A young mother with a living grandmother by her side could have more babies, and those babies were far more likely to survive the winter. The grandmothers were the safety net, but they were also the libraries. An 80-year-old woman in the Paleolithic had survived droughts, blizzards, and famines. She knew exactly which toxic root could be boiled into medicine. She knew how to read the panic in the birds to predict a coming storm. When the world fell apart, The tribe looked to the grandmothers, because they had seen it all before. Now here is a beautiful paradox. Despite all this intermingling, all this gift trading and marrying across borders, the human world was exploding into a kaleidoscope of different languages. The dirt and the DNA suggest that 50,000 years ago, the Earth was echoing with thousands of mutually incomprehensible tongues. How? Because language mutates incredibly fast. If a band splits in two and they only see each other once a year at the summer festival, within a few dozen generations, their slang will drift. Within 1,000 years, they are speaking entirely different languages. But this didn't stop them from trading. Humans are remarkably good at picking up words when their lives depend on it. Bilingualism was likely the absolute norm. The young man who left his tribe to marry into a camp 300 miles away brought his native tongue with him. His children grew up speaking a fluid, hybridized mix of both. The Paleolithic world wasn't dominated by 3 or 4 massive languages like we have today. It was a dizzying mosaic of thousands of distinct dialects, each one carrying its own unique poetry, its own hyper-specific names for the local plants, and its own songs about the stars. This was the architecture of human survival. The intimate bands were the bricks, the elders were the blueprints, the gift exchanges were the mortar. Exogamy was the steel reinforcement, and the fluid, merit-based leadership kept the whole structure from snapping in the wind. For 90,000 years, this brilliant system worked. It kept our ancestors breathing through volcanic winters and shifting ice caps. It allowed them to bounce back from the brink of extinction. It fostered the slow, agonizingly patient accumulation of wisdom that would eventually build the modern world. But it was a delicate balance. It relied on trust, open space, and the freedom to walk away from a fight. When the climate finally locked into a stable rhythm, and the human population swelled to the point where you could no longer just walk away into an empty valley, this ancient, beautiful system began to buckle. The rules were about to change. But the only reason we survived that change is because of the invisible social scaffolding our ancestors spent 90 millennia building in the dark. And then the ice came back. Imagine you are standing in the dust of East Africa 74,000 years ago. Your band knows this stretch of savanna intimately. You know the exact bend in the river where the hippos bathe. You know the rhythm of the dry season. Life is hard, it is bleeding and calloused, but it is a rhythm you understand. Your people have been running this exact survival protocol for thousands of years. Then, one morning, you wake up, and the sun simply refuses to rise. The sky does not lighten into blue, it bleeds into a bruised, suffocating red. A strange, pale snow begins to drift down from the heavens, coating the acacia trees and choking the watering holes. But it isn't snow, it is ash. Within days, it is inches thick. Within weeks, it is up to your knees. The air turns bitterly cold. The green shoots of the edible plants wither and die. The grazing herds begin to collapse into the dust, starving. What you do not know, what you could not possibly comprehend, is that 5,000 miles away, in what will one day be called Indonesia, a mountain has just torn itself apart with the fury of millions of nuclear warheads. Mount Toba has erupted. It is the single most violent volcanic event to occur in the entire history of modern Homo sapiens. We are talking about an explosion that vomited roughly 700 cubic miles of shattered rock and pulverized ash straight up into the stratosphere. To give you a sense of scale, when Mount St. Helens blew its top in 1980, it darkened skies and dropped ash across multiple states. Toba was 5,000 times larger. The immediate aftermath was hell on Earth. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high would have scrubbed the coastlines clean. But the true nightmare was the sky. All that sulfur and ash injected into the upper atmosphere acted like a massive global sunshade. It blocked the warmth of the sun for years, perhaps decades. Global temperatures plummeted by as much as 25 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't just a bad winter. It was a volcanic ice age that lasted for generations. Many geneticists and anthropologists believe this event nearly wiped the human species off the board entirely. The DNA tells a terrifying story. When we look at the genetic diversity of the 8 billion people alive today, we find a massive, haunting bottleneck. Every single one of us descends from a shockingly tiny population of humans that barely scrape through this exact window of time. We are talking about perhaps 3,000 to 10,000 reproducing individuals left on the entire planet. That is it. To put that in perspective, there are more endangered gorillas alive in the wild today than there were human beings left on Earth after Toba. But we didn't die. Against all mathematical probability, against the freezing dark and the dying herds, your ancestors held the line. They didn't just survive by cowering in a cave and getting lucky. They survived by becoming ruthlessly, brilliantly adaptable. How did they do it? That is the question that keeps scientists digging in the dirt. Because Toba wasn't just one bad year. It triggered centuries of chaotic, violent climate swings. To survive, your ancestors had to innovate faster than evolution had ever demanded. When we look at the archaeological record right after the Toba eruption, we see a sudden, frantic spike in human ingenuity. Before Toba, toolkits evolved at a sleepy glacial pace. After Toba, the dirt is practically vibrating with new ideas. We see a rapid explosion of different, highly specialized stone blades. We see evidence of people traveling much further to trade for high-quality flint, proving that the social networks were kicking into overdrive to share resources. We see a sharp increase in those pierced shells and ochre paintings, symbolic behavior used to tightly bind the terrified, starving bands together. Necessity placed a gun to humanity's head, and humanity responded with a surge of brilliance. But Toba was just the loudest explosion in a long, exhausting war against the sky. For the entire existence of modern humans, the Earth has been locked in what geologists call the Quaternary glaciation. It sounds like one long, continuous freeze, but it is actually a brutal, swinging pendulum. Deep, agonizing ice ages lasting tens of thousands of years, punctuated by brief, warm, wet periods. During the deep freezes, ice sheets miles thick crushed the northern continents. The oceans were sucked dry, dropping sea levels by 400 feet and exposing massive alien coastal plains. The Sahara Desert exploded outward, swallowing half of Africa. Forests died and turned into blowing grasslands. And then, in a geological blink of an eye, the pendulum would swing back. The temperatures would violently spike. The glaciers would melt, unleashing catastrophic floods that drowned those ancient coasts. The deserts would recede, and the jungles would reclaim the dirt. Your ancestors rode this psychotic climate pendulum dozens of times. Imagine trying to keep your culture alive when the map keeps changing. The coastal reef where your grandfather taught you to spear fish is now 60 miles inland. The lush valley where your tribe hunted for centuries has turned into a cracked, waterless pan. The caribou herds you relied on have vanished, fleeing north to chase the retreating ice. This level of environmental whiplash would shatter almost any other species, and in fact, it did. This is the era when the monsters died. The terrifying, beautiful megafauna that had ruled the earth for millions of years. The giant ground sloths, the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the towering short-faced bears, they all began to vanish. They were victims of the swinging climate, yes, but increasingly, they were victims of us. This is the dark, complicated chapter of our story. As human hunting tactics became more lethal, and as our populations slowly recovered and expanded, we began to leave a heavy, bloody fingerprint on the animal kingdom. The dirt does not lie. Almost everywhere human beings walked, the massive beasts mysteriously dropped dead shortly after. In Australia, the giant, lumbering kangaroos and the 2-ton wombats disappeared within a few tens of thousands of years of human arrival. In the Americas, 80% of the large mammal species were wiped out within a couple of millennia of those first footprints crossing Beringia. Were your ancestors callous environmental villains? Probably not. They were desperate, hungry parents trying to keep their children from starving in a world that was constantly trying to freeze them to death. They used fire to burn away forests to create better hunting grounds. They drove herds of bison off cliffs because it was safer than fighting them in the open. The climate had already pushed these massive, slow-breeding animals to the absolute brink. Human hunters simply delivered the final, fatal push. But the strategies humans invented to survive this chaos are breathtaking. On the freezing coastlines, when the land animals vanished, humans turned their eyes to the dark water. They engineered bone harpoons and woven nets, becoming masters of the kelp forests and the seal colonies. Deep in the interior, tribes memorized migration routes that spanned hundreds of miles. They didn't just wander, they scheduled their lives. They knew that if they walked to a specific high-altitude ridge exactly 3 days after the first frost, the mountain sheep would be funneling through a narrow pass. This required a profound leap in cognitive mapping. It required an abstract understanding of time, distance, and animal psychology that no other creature on Earth possessed. Every time the climate violently shifted, the human population took a hit. The genetic bottlenecks are visible in our blood, but every time the survivors learned something new, they adapted. Natural selection was working in overdrive. When the ice crept south, the humans who were built a little stockier, who could process high-fat diets, thrived. When the world turned hot and dry, the taller, leaner humans who could sweat efficiently took the lead. But the most important filter wasn't physical. It was mental. The humans who survived the apocalypse were not necessarily the ones with the thickest muscles. They were the ones with the most flexible minds. The ones who could look at a dying forest and figure out how to extract poison from a frog to hunt birds. The ones who could swallow their pride and trade their best tools with a rival tribe to secure a new water source. The ones who taught their children not just what to think, but how to think. By the time the climate finally stopped swinging, roughly 12,000 years ago, your ancestors had been forged into the ultimate biological Swiss Army knife. They were a species whose primary evolutionary advantage was the ability to adapt to absolutely anything. They had survived exploding supervolcanoes, crushing glaciers, biblical floods, and the extinction of the very animals they relied on for meat. They had been reduced to a few thousand shivering souls, and they had bounced back to claim the entire planet. They had survived horrors that would have broken any other animal. And yet, the greatest challenge of all was still waiting for them. Because all of that hard-won brilliance, all of that agonizingly slow accumulation of technology and social grace, was about to be pointed in a completely new direction. The age of wandering was ending. The trap was set. The age of civilization was about to begin. Here is the question that haunts every historian, every archaeologist, everyone who has ever stared down the long, dark tunnel of human history. Why then? Why, after 90,000 years of doing the exact same dance, chasing the herds, pulling the roots, moving with the wind, did human beings suddenly stop walking? Why did they put their spears down, plunge their hands into the dirt, plant seeds, build walls of heavy stone, and invent the crushing weight of civilization? The textbook answer is usually a neat, tidy little package. It goes like this. The Ice Age ended about 12,000 years ago. The world got warmer. The grass got greener. Some brilliant caveman realized that seeds turn into plants. Boom. Agriculture. Cities. History. But that answer is a tragic oversimplification, because it ignores a massive, glaring plot hole. Human beings had survived dozens of climate swings before this. They had seen the glaciers melt and the world turn green many times over the last 100 millennia. The end of the last ice age was not even the warmest the Earth had ever been. So why didn't someone invent a plow 50,000 years ago, or 70,000 years ago? The truth is, they couldn't. Not because they weren't smart enough. They had the exact same brains we do. But because civilization is a fire that requires 3 very specific logs to burn. It requires the right environmental trigger, the right accumulation of cultural wisdom, and most importantly, the right density of human bodies. The collision of those 3 forces only happened about 12,000 years ago, and it took 90,000 years of bleeding, walking, and observing to gather the kindling. Let us start with the sky. About 11,700 years ago, the final deep freeze of the Ice Age broke, and it broke fast. Within a few centuries, global temperatures surged. The massive, 2-mile-thick glaciers began to weep and retreat. The oceans swelled, swallowing the ancient coastlines. But then, something miraculous happened. The climate stopped swinging. It flatlined into a state of beautiful, unprecedented stability. Geologists call this golden era the Holocene. This is the missing piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just that the world got warmer, it was that the world became predictable. For the previous 100,000 years, the Earth's climate was a psychotic roller coaster. A lush green valley could turn into a cracked desert within a single human lifetime. You cannot invent agriculture when the sky is constantly changing the rules. You cannot gamble your family's life on a field of wheat if there is a massive chance the spring rains simply won't arrive next year. You cannot build a heavy stone house if the shifting climate is going to force you to walk 300 miles south just to find drinking water. But the Holocene changed the math. The seasons locked into a reliable rhythm. The rivers flowed from the same glaciers, arriving at the same time year after year. For the very first time in the history of our species, you could plant a seed in the mud in April and comfortably bet your life that you would still be standing there to harvest it in September. But a stable sky is just an opportunity. Someone has to be ready to catch it. And this is where the 90,000 years of wandering pays off. Think about the sheer volume of data your ancestors had downloaded into their collective memory. They knew exactly which wild grasses produced the fattest grains. They knew exactly when they sprouted, and what kind of soil they loved. They had already invented sickles made of razor-sharp microliths to harvest wild wheat. They had already invented heavy stone mortars to grind tough seeds into digestible flour. They had already figured out how to build woven baskets and clay-lined pits to store food for the winter. All the puzzle pieces of agriculture were already sitting on the table. They had been slowly carved out of the wilderness by thousands of generations of hunters and gatherers. And then the Natufians put the pieces together. Living in the Levant, the fertile stretch of land cradling modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, the Natufians hit the jackpot. They lived in a sweet spot where the warming climate caused massive, dense fields of wild wheat and barley to explode across the hillsides. Around 12,500 years ago, they did something radical. They stopped walking, not entirely and not all at once, but they built base camps near these massive fields of wild grain, and they stayed. They built circular stone foundations for their huts. They dragged in heavy grinding stones that were too massive to carry on a migration. Why pack up the tents and chase a lean herd of gazelle when you are surrounded by an ocean of calories swaying in the breeze? The Natufians were not farmers yet. They were still gathering wild food. But they were settling down. They started weeding out the bad plants to let the wild wheat grow thicker. They were blurring the line between foraging and farming. And then the final domino fell. Perhaps a woman noticed that the wild seeds she accidentally spilled near the latrine pit last autumn had sprouted into thick, healthy stalks. Perhaps it was a deliberate, desperate experiment when a dry summer thinned out the wild fields. However it happened, they realized the ultimate truth. You do not have to wait for the earth to provide. You can force it to. You can take the seeds, push them into the soft mud, and command the calories to grow exactly where you want them. It was not an overnight revolution. The transition from gathering wild plants to relying entirely on domesticated crops took thousands of years. Early farmers still hunted, but slowly the trap snapped shut. Because farming does one thing better than anything else on Earth. It produces a staggering, exponential amount of calories per acre. A valley that could only keep a band of 50 hunter-gatherers alive could suddenly feed 500 farmers. And this is where the human population explodes. In the nomadic days, a mother couldn't afford to have a second child until the first one was old enough to walk on their own, because she couldn't carry 2 infants on a 20-mile hike. But in a settled farming village, you don't have to carry them. You can have a baby every year. The population density skyrocketed. Villages of 50 swelled into towns of 500, and then cities of 5,000. When you pack 5,000 human beings into a tight grid of mud brick houses, the old Paleolithic rules disintegrate. You cannot run a town of 5,000 people using campfire mediation and the quiet wisdom of grandmothers. You don't know everyone's name anymore. You don't know who to trust. The intimacy is gone. To prevent the town from tearing itself apart, you have to invent new, heavy structures. You need formal hierarchies. You need a chief, a king, someone whose authority isn't just based on being a good hunter, but is enforced by men with weapons. You need specialists, people who don't grow food, but instead spend all day forging bronze, building walls, or praying to the gods. You need written laws, taxes, and borders. You need civilization. And this exact same sequence of events ignited independently in at least 6 different pockets around the globe. Because whenever human beings, carrying that deep Paleolithic toolkit, collided with a stable climate and a dense population, the equation solved itself. In the Fertile Crescent, it was wheat and pigs. In China, it was rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, it was corn and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and llamas. Different dirt, different plants, but the exact same human algorithm. Civilization was not a lucky accident. It was the inevitable, heavy fruit of 90,000 years of human brilliance, crashing into a quiet sky. But stepping into the light of civilization came with a brutal, devastating price tag. A price we are still paying today. Hunter-gatherers were generally tall, robust, and healthy. They ate a wildly diverse diet of dozens of different plants and lean meats. The first farmers, however, ate almost nothing but wheat or rice. Their bodies collapsed under the malnutrition. The bone record is heartbreaking. Early farmers were inches shorter than their nomadic grandparents. Their teeth were rotting from the sugars in the grain. Their spines and knees were warped and crushed by the endless, agonizing labor of grinding seeds and hauling water. Hunter-gatherers lived in fluid, fiercely egalitarian bands where no one could hoard the wealth. Farming invented the padlock. It invented the granary. Suddenly, one man could own all the food, and everyone else had to break their backs in his fields just to get a handful of it. It was the birth of the elite class, the birth of the peasant, the birth of extreme inequality. And then came the plagues. Hunter-gatherers rarely suffered from infectious epidemics because they were too spread out. If a virus hit a camp, it might tragically kill a few people, but the virus would die with them because there was no one else around to infect. But when you cram 5,000 malnourished humans into a town overflowing with their own waste, and you surround them with domesticated pigs, cows, and chickens, you have built the ultimate biological weapon. Smallpox mutated from cattle. The flu jumped from pigs. Measles, tuberculosis, cholera. Civilization became a breeding ground for invisible monsters. So why did we do it? If farming made us sick, shrunk our bones, and enslaved us to kings, why didn't we just drop the plows and walk back into the beautiful, wild forests? Because we couldn't. It was a numbers game, and the farmers had won. Once your neighbors start farming, their population explodes. A farming village of 1,000 people can field 200 young men with spears. A hunter-gatherer band can field maybe 10. If the farmers want the forest to chop down for firewood, they take it. The hunter-gatherers were simply drowned in a tidal wave of human bodies. It was a brutal, unavoidable arms race. You either adopted the plow or you were crushed by the people who did. Within a few short millennia, the free, wandering hunter-gatherers were pushed to the absolute fringes of the earth, into the deep deserts, the suffocating jungles, the freezing Arctic, places where the plow could not break the soil. Everywhere else, the heavy wheel of civilization rolled forward, paving over the wild world. But here is the breathtaking triumph of it all. It worked. Despite the rotting teeth, despite the plagues, despite the crushing weight of the kings, civilization survived. It took root. It built the pyramids. It mapped the orbit of Jupiter. It split the atom. It wrote symphonies, cured polio, and built the very screen you are looking at right now. And absolutely none of it would have been possible without those 90,000 years in the dark. Without the thousands of generations who walked the ice and the dust, slowly, painfully figuring out how to be human. Without the anonymous mothers who memorized the toxic plants. Without the nameless geniuses who figured out how to tie a knot, how to spark a fire in the rain, and how to sew a warm coat. Without the elders who mediated the bitter fights and the storytellers who kept the spirit of the tribe alive when the winter seemed endless. Every single one of them laid a microscopic brick in the foundation of the modern world. They were walking blindly toward a future they would never see, armed with nothing but their wits and their deep, unyielding love for their children. And when the climate finally calmed, when the stage was finally set, their descendants didn't blink. They put their hands in the dirt, and they built the world. So here we are, at the end of a 90,000-year epic, from a few scattered bands of anatomically modern humans shivering on the African savanna, through supervolcanoes that nearly choked us out of existence, across impossible oceans and frozen land bridges, to the slow, brilliant dawn of art, language, and culture. But here is the thought that should leave you sitting in absolute, quiet awe. For 90,000 years, it looked like nothing was happening. If you had a time machine, and you jumped from the year 80,000 BC to the year 20,000 BC, you would look around and think the record was skipping. The same stone blades, the same small fires, the same endless walking. No stone temples, no fields of wheat, just human beings doing what human beings had always done. Hunting, foraging, loving their children, and whispering stories to the stars. To our hyper-caffeinated modern minds, that looks like a failure. We have been brainwashed to believe that progress must be a violent, screaming rocket ship, constantly accelerating. We think if we aren't inventing a new microchip every 6 months, we are stagnating. But those 90 millennia were not a waste of time. They were the deep, heavy roots of the human tree. Everything that makes you who you are, your ability to look at a stranger and feel empathy, your capacity to learn a wildly complex language, your desperate need to find meaning in the universe, your resilience in the face of heartbreak, all of it was forged in that long, quiet crucible. Our ancestors were not waiting around for someone to invent the city. They were busy inventing the human soul. And they did it without a map, without a textbook, without any guarantee that they would wake up the next morning. They did it through the brutal, unforgiving grind of trial and error. Millions of tiny mistakes, paid for in blood, so that the next generation could walk a little taller. Just imagine the sheer, unfathomable patience of that world. If you figured out a slightly better way to chip a piece of flint, it might take your entire lifetime for that idea to reach the tribe living in the next valley. It might take 500 years for it to become the standard tool. There was no instant gratification. There was no viral fame. Just the slow, quiet breathing of human knowledge, passed from a weathered hand to a younger one by the light of a fire. And the endurance. My God, the endurance of these people. We talked about the genetic bottleneck, the thousands of years where humanity was reduced to a rounding error, a few thousand souls shivering in the dark. But even in the good years, nothing was guaranteed. Every generation watched children fade away from fevers they couldn't cure. Every generation lost hunters to the tusks of the mammoth. Entire bands were swallowed by droughts that lasted longer than a human life. And yet, they kept going. They kept bringing children into a terrifying world. They kept patiently teaching those children which berries to eat and which stars to follow. They kept stubbornly believing that there would be a tomorrow worth walking toward. That tells you something profound about who you really are. We are not built for comfort. We are built for survival. The brain sitting inside your skull right now, the mind you are using to process the sound of my voice, was hammered into shape by 90,000 years of surviving things that would kill a modern human in 3 days. We are the direct descendants of people who could walk 20 miles on an empty stomach and still have the energy to dance around the fire. People who could track a bleeding beast through a blizzard. People who held on to hope when the sky rained volcanic ash. And this is exactly why being alive today can feel so incredibly strange. Your brain is still, fundamentally, a Paleolithic machine. Your nervous system, your fight or flight response, your desperate need to belong to a tribe, your craving for purpose. It was all calibrated to keep you alive in a band of 40 people wandering a dangerous wilderness. It makes perfect sense why modern life feels so overwhelming, why social media makes us feel simultaneously hyper-connected and desperately lonely. Why a person can have a refrigerator full of food and a climate-controlled house and still feel a hollow, aching void in their chest. Our ancient brains are trying to navigate a world they were never designed for. We are trying to find our tribe among 8 billion strangers. We are trying to find deep, life or death meaning in a spreadsheet. We are trying to feel important in a world that is too loud, too bright, and moving far too fast. But it also means you are carrying a superpower that you rarely get to use. You carry the genetic memory of survivors. You have reserves of patience, of grit, of wild, unyielding resilience that are just sleeping in your DNA, waiting for the moment you actually need them. You are built from the exact same biological steel that survived the Ice Age. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden in the silence of those 90,000 years. Progress is not just about moving forward. It is about looking back. It is about standing in the quiet and realizing that every comfortable breath you take, every piece of technology you touch, every abstract thought you enjoy, was bought and paid for by people whose names have been swallowed by the dust. Nameless, faceless ghosts who lived and died in the absolute wild, but who refused to let the fire go out. If you have stayed with me through this long journey, please leave a comment down below and tell me what part of the world you are resting in tonight. Subscribe if you want to take more deep, quiet walks through the history of us. And tonight, as you drift off, perhaps take just one moment to appreciate the staggering, impossible epic that led to your existence. You are not just a person living in the modern world. You are the absolute pinnacle of 300,000 years of human survival. The latest chapter in a story that is still being written. And when you really stop to think about it, that is a beautiful thing.